In 1939, Europe stood on the edge of madness. Two colossal powers, Nazi Germany under Adolf Hitler in the West and the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin in the East, were closing in like iron jaws. Between them lay a young nation, the Second Polish Republic, reborn only 2 decades earlier after more than a century of partitions. Now it was about to be crushed again, sacrificed to the ambitions of two dictators who saw it not as a country, but as a prize. Poland had re-emerged in 1918 after the collapse of the German, Austro-Hungarian, and Russian empires at the end of the First World War. It quickly rebuilt a functioning state, but its borders were fragile, drawn by diplomats at Versailles rather than by the realities on the ground. Both Germany and Soviet Russia considered the new Poland an artificial creation of the hated Versailles Treaty. For Hitler, it represented humiliation. For Stalin, it symbolized a capitalist plot to isolate the Soviet Union. From the moment of its birth, Poland existed in the shadow of two hostile giants who both dreamed of erasing it once more. After the Polish-Soviet War of 1919–1921, Warsaw signed a peace treaty with Moscow, but the wounds remained open. In the West, Germany nursed grievances over territories ceded to Poland, especially the Danzig corridor that divided East Prussia from the rest of Germany. Hitler, who had seized power in 1933, viewed expansion eastward as essential to his vision of Lebensraum, living space for the German people. He told his generals that Germany's destiny lay in the fertile lands of the East, where Poles, Ukrainians, and Russians would serve as slaves to the Aryan race. Trying to survive between these threats, Poland pursued a precarious balance. It signed non-aggression pacts with both neighbors, with the Soviet Union in 1932 and with Germany in 1934. But the ink on those agreements barely concealed mutual hatred. In 1938, after Britain and France allowed Hitler to seize the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia at Munich, Poland opportunistically occupied a small disputed region called Zaolzie. That decision alienated the Western powers and convinced Hitler that Warsaw was both greedy and isolated, a victim waiting to be devoured. The next step was Danzig. Hitler demanded that Poland return the free city of Danzig to Germany and permit the construction of an extraterritorial highway across the corridor. Warsaw refused. Prime Minister Felician Składkowski declared, "If Germany demands Danzig, it is not a question of territory but of independence. Poland will fight, even alone." Hitler, however, wanted far more than Danzig. He wanted all of Poland, and beyond it, the gates to Eastern Europe and Russia. But he feared a two-front war if the Soviets intervened. For that reason, he turned to Stalin with an astonishing proposal. On August 23, 1939, the foreign ministers Joachim von Ribbentrop and Vyacheslav Molotov signed the German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact in Moscow. Publicly, it promised peace between ideological enemies. Secretly, it contained a protocol dividing Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. Germany would take Western Poland and Lithuania. The Soviet Union would claim Eastern Poland, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and Bessarabia. When Ribbentrop returned to Berlin, Hitler was jubilant. "Stalin has agreed," he told his generals. "Now, nothing can stop us." 1 week later, on September 1st, the guns opened fire. At 4:45 a.m., the German battleship Schleswig-Holstein, supposedly on a friendly visit to Danzig, began shelling the Polish garrison at Westerplatte. Those thunderous blasts marked the beginning of the Second World War. Hitler announced to the world that Poland had attacked first and that Germany was merely responding. The claim was false, part of a series of staged provocations ordered by the SS. On the night before the invasion, German agents dressed in Polish uniforms had staged fake raids on border posts, radio stations, and railway yards. Dead bodies from concentration camps were left behind as evidence. But within hours, propaganda no longer mattered. The war had begun. Germany unleashed 1.5 million soldiers, 3,200 tanks, and 2,000 aircraft. Poland had roughly 1 million troops, many still mobilizing, and few modern weapons. The German plan, codenamed Case White, called for a swift pincer movement. Forces from East Prussia in the north and from Silesia and Slovakia in the south would converge on Warsaw, encircling the Polish armies west of the Vistula River. It was the first full demonstration of blitzkrieg, lightning war, combining tanks, motorized infantry, and dive bombers into a single, fast-moving weapon. The sky over Poland filled with the shriek of Stuka dive bombers. Their sirens were designed to terrify as much as to kill. Columns of refugees, trains, hospitals, and marketplaces were bombed indiscriminately. A German war correspondent later wrote, "I saw a woman carrying a child run across the road, and then she was gone in a cloud of smoke. No one talked of honor anymore, it was slaughter. Yet Polish resistance was fierce. At Mokra, a cavalry brigade held off German armor for 2 days. At Wisna, 700 soldiers resisted 42,000 Germans for 3 days in what became known as the Polish Thermopylae. Near Krojanti, a detachment of Uhlan lancers attacked German infantry and was counterattacked by tanks. Foreign journalists exaggerated the event into the myth of Polish horsemen charging tanks, propaganda that mocked Polish courage and glorified German technology. Despite heroic defense, the Polish lines broke under overwhelming pressure. On September 8th, German tanks reached the outskirts of Warsaw. The city prepared for siege. Mayor Stefan Starzyński broadcast to the nation, "We shall fight on every street and every house. Warsaw will never surrender." 2 days earlier, Britain and France had declared war on Germany. In Warsaw, people danced in the streets shouting, "We are not alone." They did not yet know that their allies would not attack. On the Western Front, the French and British armies sat behind the Maginot Line, waiting. The so-called phony war had begun. As German forces closed around Warsaw, the Polish High Command hoped to regroup in the southeast and hold out until the Allies attacked in the west. But before they could act, disaster struck from another direction. At dawn on September 17, 1939, Soviet forces crossed Poland's eastern frontier. Nearly 500,000 Red Army soldiers with thousands of tanks and aircraft advanced under the pretext of protecting Ukrainians and Belarusians after the collapse of the Polish state. In truth, Stalin was claiming his share of the spoils under the secret pact with Hitler. Many Polish troops, exhausted and cut off, mistook the Soviets for allies. Janusz Bardak, a young soldier, remembered, "When I saw the Red Army uniforms, I felt relief. I thought they had come to fight the Germans. But then they shouted for us to drop our weapons. A man who hesitated was shot. Only then did I understand." At Grodno, schoolboys and civilians fought Soviet tanks with gasoline bottles. In Lwów, German and Soviet officers coordinated a joint siege before dividing the city. On September 22nd in the town of Brest-Litovsk, German and Soviet units held a joint victory parade. Generals Heinz Guderian and Semyon Krivoshein stood together under arches decorated with both swastikas and red stars. Europe watched in disbelief. By the end of September, Poland was trapped between its two conquerors. The government and Commander-in-Chief Edward Rydz-Śmigły fled to Romania. The last strongholds at Modlin and Kock fought on but could not change the outcome. On September 28th, Warsaw surrendered after weeks of bombardment. Hitler announced, "Poland has ceased to exist. The work of Versailles is undone." Stalin, ever cold and pragmatic, remarked, "The friendship between Germany and the Soviet Union has been sealed in Polish blood." The campaign lasted just 36 days, but the nightmare that followed would last years. The two occupying powers immediately set about dismantling the Polish nation. In the German zone, SS leader Reinhard Heydrich ordered, "The Polish leadership must be eliminated without delay. The nobles, priests, and Jews are to be killed. The common people will serve as slaves." Special SS units known as Einsatzgruppen began mass shootings of Jews and Polish intelligentsia. In Częstochowa, 1,000 civilians were murdered. In Przemysl, 500 Jews were executed. Over 15,000 people were killed in such actions during the 5-week campaign, not counting tens of thousands more who died in air raids. The Wehrmacht, supposedly a professional army, also participated in atrocities. Civilians were shot as partisans, villages burned as examples. A German officer later confessed, "The Führer made it clear, this is a war of annihilation." In the Soviet zone, the NKVD rounded up officers, teachers, priests, and civil servants, anyone who might represent Polish identity. Tens of thousands were deported to labor camps deep inside the USSR. In the spring of 1940, more than 20,000 captured officers were executed in forests near Kaitan, Kharkov, and Kalinin, their bodies buried in mass graves. For decades, the Soviet Union denied responsibility. While the occupiers terrorized the population, fragments of the Polish army continued to resist. Some units escaped through Hungary and Romania to France and Britain. Others went underground, forming the nucleus of the Polish Home Army that would fight throughout the war. Warsaw's destruction was apocalyptic. The bombing of September 25, 1939, later called Black Monday, involved 370 German aircraft dropping hundreds of tons of incendiaries. 40,000 civilians died in one day. Mayor Starzyński made his final broadcast. "I no longer ask for help. There is no time. I demand revenge for the churches reduced to ashes, for the tears and blood of the innocent dead. Tell the world, Warsaw fights on. Poland is not yet lost." After the surrender, the German and Soviet regimes divided the spoils. Germany annexed Western Poland and incorporated millions of Poles into the Reich as forced laborers. The Soviets absorbed Eastern Poland into Ukraine and Belarus, deporting or executing anyone who resisted. Hitler and Stalin adjusted their borders again to trade raw materials and ensure cooperation. For a brief moment, the two dictators stood as partners, their empires united by cynicism and greed. Nazi propagandists trumpeted the victory as proof of Blitzkrieg's invincibility. In reality, even German commanders admitted that the campaign had exposed serious weaknesses. Ammunition stocks were low, supply lines fragile, and many divisions still relied on horses rather than trucks. But the myth of unstoppable lightning war was born, and it would terrify Europe for the next 2 years. Poland's losses were catastrophic. Between 70 and 120,000 soldiers killed, 700,000 captured by the Germans, and 220,000 by the Soviets. Civilian deaths reached up to 200,000. German losses were 15,000 dead and 30,000 wounded. Soviet casualties were smaller. For Poland, the war had not truly ended, it had only changed form. Its government continued in exile, first in France and later in London. Polish pilots would soon fight in the skies over Britain. Polish soldiers would storm Monte Cassino and liberate parts of Europe that their own homeland would not see free again for half a century. The invasion of Poland in 1939 was more than the beginning of the Second World War. It was a demonstration of what happens when two totalitarian powers cooperate to destroy a nation, and a warning of the horrors to come. The Holocaust, the mass deportations, the destruction of entire cities, all were foreshadowed here. For the ordinary Polish people, the war was not fought in the halls of diplomacy or in grand strategy, but in the basements, forests, and streets where they struggled simply to survive. One nurse in Warsaw wrote in her diary, "We have lost our country, but not our soul. We shall return." When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, Poland was nominally free but occupied once more, this time by the Soviet Union. Only in 1989 did it regain full independence. The ghosts of 1939, however, never disappeared. They remain in the ruins, the cemeteries, and the memories of a nation that was torn apart and yet endured. History remembers 1939 as the year the world caught fire, and Poland as the first flame. Hitler believed Europe would stay silent, and for a time he was right. But from the ashes of Warsaw, the fire spread until the whole world burned. 70 million people would die before that fire was extinguished, and humanity learned, if only briefly, that silence in the face of evil is itself a crime.